Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at a stack of sources that really unpack the story of nationalism in India, our focus, that incredibly dynamic period starting from the 1920s onwards.
Right. We're diving into how this powerful sense of shared identity, of being a nation, really took root in India.
Yeah.
And importantly, how it wasn't just a simple import of European ideas about nation states. It was something forged in a very unique crucible.
These sources give us a fantastic lens on how people, despite incredible differences, somehow came together in the fight against colonialism. That shared struggle became a powerful unifier, didn't it?
It really did. But the mission here is also to see the layers beneath that unity. How did different groups, peasants, workers, women, different religious communities, how did they experience this struggle?
What did freedom actually mean?
Exactly. What did freedom or Swaraj actually mean to them on the ground? It's about understanding the major movements, yes, but also the internal tensions, the challenges to that unity, and the surprising ways people connected to this powerful emerging idea of India.
So to really grasp this, we probably need to set the scene. Let's start right after World War I.
Absolutely. You see, modern nationalism in places like India wasn't some abstract concept floating around. It was deeply, intrinsically linked to the anti-colonial movement.
Okay.
People found unity not just in, say, shared heritage, but in their collective struggle against oppression. That was key.
And the First World War just threw everything into chaos, creating a totally new and volatile situation, right?
It did, massively. The war demanded immense resources, and the British financed their increased defense spending largely through, taxing India. War loans, higher customs duties, and they even introduced income tax for the first time. You can imagine the economic squeeze this put on ordinary people.
Yeah, and the squeeze just got tighter, didn't it?
Oh, significantly. Prices basically doubled between 1913 and 1918. This caused immense hardship. And on top of that, rural areas saw forced recruitment into the army, which naturally led to deep anger and resentment.
So you've got this widespread economic pain, this resentment, and then nature just piled on the misery.
Tragically, yes. Crop failures in 1918-19 and again in 1920-21 led to severe food shortages. And right alongside this was the horrific influenza epidemic.
Spanish flu.
Exactly. The census of 1921 is just sobering. It estimated somewhere between 12 and 13 million people died from famine and the epidemic combined.
That number is just staggering. People must have been desperately hoping things would get better after the war ended.
That was the hope, that the hardships would ease up. But they didn't materialize. This intense period of hardship, this deep well of discontent, it really created fertile ground. It sort of set the stage for a new kind of leader to step forward and propose a radically different way to resist.
Which brings us neatly to that leader and his revolutionary idea, Satyagraha.
Indeed. That leader was, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. He returned to India in January 1915 after years in South Africa, where he'd already honed this unique method of challenging injustice through mass action.
And he called it Satyagraha. It's more than just nonviolence, though, isn't it? It's a deeper concept.
Much more. At its heart, Satyagraha means holding on to truth, or the search for truth. Gandhi's belief was that if your cause was true, if your struggle was fundamentally against injustice, then physical force wasn't necessary to defeat the oppressor.
Okay, so how does it work then, if not through force?
By appealing to the opponent's conscience. It's about persuading them to see the truth of the situation through the sheer force of suffering, through nonviolence. Gandhi was convinced that ultimately truth was bound to triumph.
And our source actually quotes Gandhi directly on this, emphasizing it isn't passive at all. He says Satyagraha is intense, active activity, pure soul force, filled with knowledge and the flame of love.
Exactly. He contrasts this with the reality that India couldn't possibly match Britain militarily in terms of arms. Instead, he argued, the millions in India possessed a different kind of power, the power of nonviolence, which he called the supreme dharma, the highest moral duty.
And he wasn't just theorizing, was he? He put these ideas into practice pretty quickly with local movements once he returned.
He did. Successfully. Crucial early tests. In 1917, he championed the cause of peasants in Champaran, Bihar, against a really oppressive plantation system.
Right.
Later that year, in Kedah, Gujarat, he led peasants demanding revenue relief because of crop failure and plague. And then in 1918, he supported cotton mill workers in Ahmedabad. These were absolutely crucial testing grounds for his methods.
And these local successes presumably gave him the confidence to try something on a much bigger national scale.
Precisely. By 1919, he felt ready to call for a nationwide satyagraha against something called the Rowlatt Act.
What was it about the Roe Act that made it such a flashpoint?
It was hugely unpopular. It was passed really hurriedly, despite widespread Indian opposition. It gave the government these sweeping powers to suppress political activity and, crucially, allowed for detention without trial for up to 2 years.
Wow.
It felt like a direct assault on basic rights, on civil liberties.
And Gandhi's response was this call for nonviolent civil disobedience, kicking off with a general strike on April 6, 1919.
Yes, and the response was powerful. You saw rallies, workers striking in places like railway workshops, shops closing down across the country. It showed a real willingness among people to protest.
How did the British administration react to that?
They were alarmed, definitely. Alarmed by the scale of the protest and fearful of disruption, they clamped down hard. Local leaders were arrested, particularly in Amritsar, and Gandhi himself was actually prevented from entering Delhi.
And this clampdown led directly to tragedy in Amritsar.
It did. On April 10th, the police fired on a peaceful procession in Amritsar. This then sparked retaliation from the crowds, who attacked symbols of government like banks and post offices. Martial law was imposed, and the military commander, General Dyer, took charge.
Leading to the infamous Jallianwala Bagh massacre just days later, on April 13th.
A truly horrific event. A large crowd had gathered in this enclosed ground, Jallianwala Bagh. Some were there to protest the earlier arrests in the Rowlatt Act, but many, many others were just there for the Baisakhi festival, a major annual fair.
And crucially,
many villagers who had come in for the fair were completely unaware that martial law had even been imposed.
And Dyer's actions were just unconscionable.
Absolutely. He entered the ground, blocked the single main exit, without any warning whatsoever, ordered his troops to open fire on the unarmed crowd. Hundreds were killed. It was a massacre.
And his stated reason for this appalling brutality, what did he say?
He later declared his objective was to, and I quote, produce a moral effect. To strike terror and awe into the hearts of the satyagrahis, the protesters. It was a deliberate act of mass punishment designed to intimidate.
The aftermath sounds just as brutal from the sources.
It was. As news of Jallianwala Bagh spread, strikes, clashes, and attacks on government buildings erupted in towns across North India. The government responded with shocking repression. Forcing satyagrahis to crawl on their stomachs, rub their noses on the ground, salute all officials. People were publicly flogged, and in one instance near Gujranwala, villages were even bombed from the air.
Seeing all this violence spreading, Gandhi decided to call off the movement.
He did. He felt the movement was turning violent in too many places, and that people needed more preparation, more training, and non-violent methods before they could properly engage in mass struggle.
So the Rowlatt Satyagraha, it showed the potential for nationwide protest, but it was largely limited to cities and towns. Gandhi knew he needed a way to involve more people, to build a truly pan-Indian movement.
And he realized that couldn't happen without bridging the divide between Hindus and Muslims. He saw a potential opportunity in something called the Khilafat issue.
The Khilafat issue that stemmed from the end of World War I and the fate of the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. After the defeat of Ottoman Turkey, which had sided with Germany, there were fears and rumors among Muslims worldwide that a harsh peace treaty would be imposed on the Ottoman Sultan. And he was also seen as the Khalifa, the spiritual head of the Islamic world.
This led to the formation of the Khilafat Committee in India.
Yes, in Bombay, March 1919. You had young Muslim leaders like Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali becoming prominent. They were looking for ways to defend the Khalifa's position in power, and they started discussing the possibility of united mass action with Gandhi.
And Gandhi saw this as a critical opening for Hindu-Muslim unity, didn't he?
Precisely. He felt that taking up the Khilafat cause was an unprecedented opportunity to bring Muslims under the umbrella of a unified national movement against the British.
This led to a really crucial Congress session in Calcutta, September 1920.
That's where Gandhi worked hard to convince other Congress leaders that the time was right to launch a non-cooperation movement. It would be a campaign for Swaraj, yes, but also explicitly in support of the Khilafat issue, bringing those two together.
The idea of non-cooperation itself, just refusing to cooperate with the British, that came from his earlier writing, Hind Swaraj, right?
That's right, from 1909. His core argument was pretty straightforward. British rule survived in India only because Indians cooperated with it. If Indians simply refused to cooperate, he believed, the whole structure of the Raj would collapse within a year, and Swaraj would be achieved.
So what was the actual plan for this non-cooperation movement? How was it supposed to work on the ground?
It was planned in stages. It would begin with symbolic actions like surrendering titles and honors granted by the British government.
Okay.
Then it would escalate to boycotts of government institutions, civil services, the army, police, courts, legislative councils, schools, and colleges, and crucially, a boycott of foreign goods.
Systematic withdrawal of Indian support from the whole system.
Exactly. And the plan included the idea that if the government responded with repression, the movement would then move to full civil disobedience, including non-payment of taxes.
Gandhi and the Ali brothers, the Khilafat leaders, toured extensively to build support for this.
They traveled across India in the summer of 1920, spreading the message. But the idea wasn't universally accepted within Congress, not immediately. There was a real debate, an intense tussle for a few months.
What were the main concerns?
Some leaders were hesitant about boycotting the council elections scheduled for November 1920. They feared it might lead to popular violence. There was a genuine concern about maintaining nonviolence on such a large scale.
So there was significant opposition within their own ranks for a time.
Yes. For a while between September and December 1920, it seemed there might even be a split between supporters and opponents of the non-cooperation plan within Congress. But a compromise was eventually worked out.
At the Nagpur Congress session in December 1920.
Right. At Nagpur, the non-cooperation program was formally adopted. This cleared the way for the movement to officially begin in January 1921.
And almost as soon as it started, it became clear that while this was conceived as a single massive movement, people were participating with very different understandings of what Swaraj actually meant for them in their daily lives.
That's perhaps one of the most crucial insights from the sources we're looking at. Swaraj was this incredibly powerful rallying cry, but its meaning was interpreted through the lens of people's own lives, their own immediate struggles and aspirations.
Let's look at some examples, maybe starting with the movement in the towns and cities.
Okay. In the cities, the movement initially kicked off with significant participation from the middle class. Thousands of students left government-controlled schools and colleges. Headmasters and teachers resigned. Lawyers gave up their legal practices.
And the boycott of foreign goods, that sounds like it had a major economic impact.
It certainly did. Liquor shops were ticketed. That means people stood outside, urging customers not to enter. And foreign cloth was collected and burned in huge public bonfires. This led to pretty dramatic results. The import of foreign cloth nearly halved between 1921 and 1922. Its value dropped enormously.
So a definite economic win for Indian producers, presumably.
Yes. As people turned away from foreign textiles, production in Indian textile mills and handlooms saw a significant increase. Merchants and traders also largely refused to trade in foreign goods or finance foreign trade. It was a powerful economic statement. However, the momentum in the cities eventually slowed down.
Why did it lose steam there?
Well, a couple of reasons. Partly because khadi, the hand-spun, hand-woven cloth promoted by Gandhi, was often more expensive than mass-produced British mill cloth. This made it hard for poor city dwellers to afford the boycott long-term.
Practical limitation.
Exactly. And also, the boycott British institutions created a practical problem. Where were the alternative Indian schools, colleges, or even courts for lawyers to work in? These alternative institutions were slow to be set up. So eventually, many students, teachers, and lawyers drifted back to the government institutions simply out of necessity.
Right. Meanwhile, the movement was taking on quite different forms out in the countryside, often building on existing local grievances and struggles.
Exactly. The call for non-cooperation resonated deeply with peasants and tribal communities who were already struggling against specific forms of oppression they faced daily.
Like in Awadh, in modern-day Uttar Pradesh.
In Awadh, the peasant movement was led by a fascinating figure, a sannyasi named Baba Ramchandra, who had himself been an indentured laborer in Fiji. Their anger was directed primarily at the powerful taluktars and landlords who demanded exorbitant rents and a whole range of other fees or cesses.
And peasants were forced to do bagar, that unpaid labor we mentioned.
Right. Imagine being forced to work for free on the land your family has probably cultivated for generations. With absolutely no security of tenure, you could be evicted at any time. That indignity, plus the economic burden, fueled deep resentment. Their demands were quite clear. Lower rents, abolish bigar, and socially boycott oppressive landlords. They even organized Nairobi bands, where barbers and washermen refused services to these landlords.
Jawaharlal Nehru actually visited these areas and saw the struggle firsthand.
He did. Nehru toured Awadh villages in June 1920, talking to the peasants, trying to understand their grievances. This interaction led to the formation of the Utkisan Sabha, the Awadh Peasants Association, in October 1920, with Nehru, Baba Ramchandra, and others involved. It grew incredibly rapidly, with hundreds of branches set up within months.
Congress tried to bring these peasant struggles into the broader national fold.
They did attempt to integrate the Awad peasant struggle into the wider non-cooperation movement. But the movement on the ground often took directions the Congress leadership didn't anticipate or frankly approve of. In 1921, peasant anger boiled over into attacks on the houses of palakdars and merchants, bazaars were looted, and grain hoards were taken over.
So it wasn't strictly following the nonviolent path that Gandhi envisioned.
No, not always. And interestingly, local leaders sometimes invoked Gandhi's name, claiming he had sanctioned things like the non-payment of taxes, or even that land would be redistributed to the landless. This shows how the Mahatma's name was being used, perhaps interpreted to lend legitimacy to local actions and aspirations, even if they weren't strictly part of the official Congress program.
Yeah, there's that quote from Nehru in the sources about witnessing police firing near Raebareli and his own internal struggle with nonviolence.
It's a very poignant account, showing the complexities and the violence that sometimes erupted. And it wasn't just peasants like in Awad. Tribal groups were also involved in their own distinct struggles, for instance, in the Gudam Hills of Andhra Pradesh.
Right, and their movement was quite different again?
Here, a militant guerrilla movement took hold in the early 1920s, another strand that definitely diverged from the Congress's official nonviolent path. Their grievances were largely rooted in the colonial government's forest policies.
How so? By closing off large forest areas.
Exactly. This prevented the hill people from grazing their cattle or collecting essential fuelwood and fruits activities that were vital parts of their livelihoods and also deeply connected to their traditional rights. Then, on top of that, they were often forced to contribute bigar unpaid labor for things like road building. This felt like a double blow to their way of life and autonomy.
And they had a really fascinating leader in Lori Sitaram Raju.
Raju was quite a charismatic figure. He claimed mystical powers, people believed he could make accurate astrological predictions, heal people, even survive bullet shots. The rebels came to see him almost as an incarnation of God, which gave him immense authority and loyalty.
What was his take on the larger national movement on Gandhi?
It's interesting, he actually spoke about Gandhi's greatness, was inspired by the non-cooperation movement, and even persuaded his followers to wear khadi and give up drinking. But, and this is crucial, he was absolutely adamant that India could only be liberated through the use of force, not nonviolence.
So his actions reflected that core belief.
Yes. The Gudam rebels under his leadership attacked police stations, attempted to assassinate British officials, and waged guerrilla warfare for Swaraj. Raju was eventually captured and executed by the British in 1924, but his actions solidified his status as a folk hero among the tribal people.
We also see a very unique interpretation of Swaraj among plantation workers, for example in Assam.
Yes, for them, freedom meant something incredibly specific and immediate: the right to move freely. Under the harsh Inland Emigration Act of 1859, plantation workers were essentially confined to the tea gardens. They weren't allowed to leave without permission, and permission was very rarely granted.
So when they heard about the non-cooperation movement and Gandhi,
thousands of them defied the authorities, abandoned the plantations, and started heading towards what they believed were their home villages. They had this understanding that Gandhi Raj was coming, and under Gandhi Raj, everyone would be given land in their own villages.
Wow.
It shows how they translated the abstract idea of Swaraj into their own immediate, deeply personal desire for freedom of movement and reconnection with their ancestral homes.
But they faced a harsh reality on that journey.
They did. They were often stranded on their journey because of strikes on the railways and steamers, then caught by the police and brutally beaten up. A tragic outcome.
It's so clear from all these examples, Awad, Gudam Hills, the Assam plantations, that the vision of Swaraj wasn't uniform at all. It was interpreted through the very specific lens of local oppressions and local desires.
Absolutely. They defined Swaraj primarily as an end to their own particular suffering and troubles. Yet the fact that they chanted Gandhi's name or linked their local actions, however loosely, to the Congress movement, suggests they were emotionally connecting to something larger in all India agitation that went beyond their immediate village or region.
Okay, so after the peak of non-cooperation and its eventual withdrawal in 1922, what happened next? Where did the nationalist movement go?
Well, Mahatma Gandhi called off the non-cooperation movement in February 1922. This was directly after the Chari Chari incident, where a peaceful demonstration in a bazaar turned into a violent clash with the police, resulting in deaths. Gandhi felt the movement was turning violent and that the satyagrahis, the participants, needed more thorough training in nonviolent discipline.
And this decision led to some significant debate within the Congress party itself, didn't it?
It certainly did. Some leaders within Congress were getting, frankly, tired of mass struggles and the risks involved. They began to argue that it might be more effective to participate in the elections for provincial councils, which had been set up by the Government of India Act of 1919.
Why participate in British-created councils?
Their goal was to work within the system to oppose British policies from the inside, argue for reform, and also use the councils as a platform to demonstrate that these institutions weren't truly democratic.
And this group went on to form the Swaraj Party.
Correct. Led by prominent figures like C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru, they wanted to re-engage with council politics as a different strategy.
But there were others, particularly younger leaders, who wanted a more direct, more radical approach.
Yes, absolutely. Figures like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose were pushing strongly for continued, more radical mass agitation and for a clearer goal of Purna Swaraj, full, complete independence, not just reforms or dominion status within the British framework.
So you have this internal strategic difference bubbling up. And then two major external factors emerged in the late 1920s that really reshaped the political landscape.
Exactly. First, there was the impact of the worldwide economic depression.
Yeah.
Agricultural prices started dropping significantly from around 1926 and then just collapsed after 1930.
Which, as we saw earlier, had a devastating impact on peasants, making it impossible to pay revenue demands.
Precisely. As demand for agricultural goods fell and cash income dried up, the countryside was in deep turmoil by 1930. This created a whole new layer of widespread grievance, making many people ready for mobilization again.
The second major factor was the appointment of the Statutory Commission, better known as the Simon Commission.
Yes, this became a huge point of contention. It was set up by the new Tory government in Britain, under Sir John Simon, ostensibly to look into the functioning of the constitutional system in India and suggest changes. The fundamental problem: it had no Indian members. Zero. It was an all-British commission set up to decide India's political future.
Understandably, when the commission arrived in India in 1928, it was met with massive protests, with slogans like, "Go back, Simon," everywhere.
Yes, it was a rare moment of unity. All major parties, including the Congress and the Muslim League, participated in demonstrations against it. This widespread opposition put pressure on the British, leading to an offer from the Viceroy, Lord Irwin.
In October 1929, he made this vague offer of dominion status at some point in the future, and a roundtable conference.
Right. A promise of dominion status at some unspecified future date, and an invitation to discuss a future constitution at a roundtable conference in London. It was quite vague, and didn't really satisfy the increasingly assertive Congress leaders.
Especially not the younger, more radical wing pushing for full independence.
Precisely. Leaders like Nehru and Bose became much more assertive within Congress. The influence of the more moderate liberals who favored gradual constitutional reform began to wane.
This all culminated in the landmark Lahore Congress session in December 1929.
Yes, a really pivotal moment. Under Jawaharlal Nehru's presidency, the Congress formalized its demand. The goal was no longer just Swaraj, but Purna Swaraj, full independence for India.
And they declared January 26, 1930, as Independence Day.
A day for people across India to take a pledge, committing themselves to the struggle for complete independence. However, the sources note that these initial celebrations on Jan 26 didn't actually attract massive public attention. Gandhi realized he needed something more tangible, something relatable to everyday life, to connect the abstract idea of freedom to the concrete issues faced by ordinary people.
And he found that powerful, universally relatable symbol in salt.
Salt was really a stroke of genius. It's a basic necessity, consumed by everyone, rich or poor, Hindu or Muslim. The British government's tax on salt and its monopoly over salt production was a clear, undeniable example of colonial oppression that affected every single person in a very tangible way.
So on January 31st, 1930, Gandhi sent his famous letter to Viceroy Irwin.
Yes, stating 11 demands. These were wide-ranging, covering general interests, but also specific demands of different classes in an attempt to unite various groups behind a common platform. But the most significant, the most stirring demand was the abolition of the salt tax.
It was essentially an ultimatum, wasn't it? Meet these demands by March 11th, or Congress would launch a campaign of civil disobedience.
Exactly. Irwin was unwilling to negotiate on these terms. So Gandhi launched his famous Salt March.
Starting from his ashram at Sabarmati with just 78 trusted volunteers, a number that swelled dramatically as they marched.
Yes, the march covered over 240 miles to the coastal town of Dandi in Gujarat. They walked for 24 days, covering about 10 miles a day. Along the route, thousands came to hear Gandhi speak. He talked about the meaning of Swaraj and urged people to peacefully defy the British.
And on April 6, 1930, he reached Dandi and ceremonially broke the salt law.
By manufacturing salt from boiling seawater, this simple symbolic act was the official start of the nationwide civil disobedience movement.
How was this civil disobedience movement fundamentally different from the non-cooperation movement of 1921-22?
That's a key distinction. In non-cooperation, people were asked primarily not to cooperate with British rule, boycotting institutions, etc. In civil disobedience, they were asked to go a step further, to actively break specific colonial laws, starting with the Salt Law.
And the movement spread like wildfire across the country.
It really did. Thousands of different parts of the country broke the Salt Law, manufacturing salt and demonstrating in front of government salt factories. The boycott of foreign cloth continued, liquor shops were picketed, peasants refused to pay revenue and the local chakadari taxes. Village officials resigned in large numbers. Even forest dwellers began violating colonial forest laws, going into reserve forests to collect wood and graze cattle.
The government's reaction, predictably, was swift and brutal.
Yes, they began arresting Congress leaders one by one. This often led to violent clashes. For example, when Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout disciple of Gandhi, often called the Frontier Gandhi, was arrested in April 1930 in Peshawar, angry crowds took to the streets. They faced armored cars and police firing, resulting in many deaths.
And when Gandhi himself was arrested about a month later,
industrial workers in Sholapur in Maharashtra attacked symbols of British authority, police posts, municipal buildings, law courts, railway stations, basically anything that represented British rule. The state responded with heavy repression everywhere. Peaceful satyagrahis were attacked, women and children were beaten, and our sources indicate something like 100,000 people were arrested over the course of the movement.
This intense period of confrontation and repression eventually led to another pause in the movement, didn't it?
Yes, faced with this escalating situation and widespread repression, Mahatma Gandhi decided to call off the movement once again. In March 1931, he entered into what became known as the Gandhi-Irwin Pact.
What did that pact involve? What were the terms?
Essentially, Gandhi agreed to participate in the Second Roundtable Conference in London. Remember, Congress had boycotted the first one. In return, the government agreed to release the political prisoners arrested during the civil disobedience movement.
So Gandhi went to London for the conference in December 1931, but it didn't yield the desired breakthrough.
No. The negotiations ultimately broke down, and he returned to India disappointed. Back in India, he found that the government, under a new viceroy, had begun a fresh cycle of repression. The Congress was declared illegal again, and strict measures were put in place to prevent meetings, demonstrations, and boycotts. Key leaders like Ghaffar Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru were back in jail.
So Gandhi reluctantly relaunched the civil disobedience movement.
He did, in early 1932. But the movement this time around struggled to regain its initial intensity and fervor. It continued for over a year but gradually lost momentum and was finally called off completely by 1934.
One of the most revealing aspects of these sources, I think, is how they explore how different social groups experienced and interpreted this civil disobedience movement. What did Swaraj actually look like from their distinct perspectives?
This is where the picture of Indian nationalism becomes so beautifully complex and layered. Let's take the rich peasant communities, for example, groups like the Patidars of Gujarat or the Jats of Uttar Pradesh. They were often very active participants in the movement, organizing their communities, sometimes even pressuring reluctant members to join boycotts.
And their motivation was largely driven by the economic depression hitting their commercial crops, right?
Precisely. As producers of commercial crops, the catastrophic fall in prices meant they simply couldn't sell their harvests or meet the government's inflexible revenue demands. For them, Swaraj was fundamentally a struggle against these high revenues. They were enthusiastic supporters, but they were also deeply disappointed when the movement was called off in 1931 without the revenue rates being revised. This disappointment meant many were reluctant to participate when the movement was relaunched in 1932.
The poorer peasantry, often tenants rather than landowners, had slightly different concerns, didn't they?
Absolutely. They weren't just interested in lowering the revenue demand. Many were small tenants, cultivating land they rented from landlords. For them, the biggest problem, especially as the depression deepened and their incomes vanished, was paying the rent to their landlords.
So they were looking for no rent campaigns, which wasn't always something Congress was eager to support.
Exactly. The Congress was often hesitant to fully back these no-rent campaigns because they feared alienating the rich peasants and landlords, who provided crucial support and funding for the broader nationalist movement. This created a definite tension, and you see poorer peasants sometimes joining more radical movements, often led by socialists or communists, who were more willing to take up the rent issue.
Okay, what about the business classes? How did Indian industrialists and merchants see the movement?
Indian industrialists and merchants had actually grown quite powerful, especially after making huge profits during World War I. They were keen on expanding their businesses and deeply resented colonial policies that restricted their activities, things like tariffs that favored British goods, or the unfavorable rupee-sterling exchange ratio.
So they started organizing to represent their interests more formally.
Yes, they formed influential organizations like the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920, and later FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, in 1927. Led by prominent industrialists like Purushottam Thakurdas and G.D. Birla, they initially supported the civil disobedience movement quite strongly.
How did they support it?
They attacked colonial control over the Indian economy, provided financial assistance to the movement, and refused to buy or sell imported goods. For many of them, Swaraj meant an end to these colonial restrictions, allowing Indian trade and industry to flourish without constraints. However, after the failure of the Round Table Conference and the relaunch of the movement, their enthusiasm wasn't uniform. Some became apprehensive, worried about the spread of militant activities, the disruption to business caused by prolonged agitation, and also the growing influence of socialist ideas within the younger sections of Congress.
How did the industrial working class engage with the CDM? Was there large-scale participation?
Generally, they didn't participate in large numbers across the board, perhaps with the exception of the Nagpur region. One reason suggested is that as industrialists drew closer to the Congress, workers tended to stay somewhat aloof, seeing their class interests as different. But that doesn't mean there was no participation.
So some workers did get involved.
Yes, some did participate, often selectively adopting Gandhian ideas like the boycott of foreign goods as part of their own movements against low wages and poor working conditions.
Any specific examples?
Yes, the sources mention strikes by railway workers in 1930 and dock workers in 1932. And in 1930, thousands of workers in the Chota-Nagpur tin mines famously wore Gandhi caps and participated in protest rallies, though their specific demands were related to their own wages and working conditions. Again, you see Congress often being reluctant to fully incorporate workers' demands into its main platform, partly out of fear of alienating the industrialists and potentially dividing the anti-imperial front.
Now, one group that did participate on a massive scale, perhaps for the first time in such numbers, was women.
That was a really striking feature of the civil disobedience movement. Thousands upon thousands of women, many of whom had previously lived relatively secluded lives within their homes, came out onto the streets. They listened to Gandhi's speeches during the Salt March, they participated in protest marches, they manufactured salt, and they picketed foreign cloth and liquor shops. Large numbers of women were arrested and went to jail.
And these women often came from particular backgrounds.
Yes, the sources suggest many were from urban, high-caste families, or from relatively well-off peasant households in rural areas. They were deeply moved by Gandhi's call to service, seeing participation in the freedom struggle as a sacred duty to the nation. You see powerful images from the time showing women marching in processions.
But did this increased public role translate into a fundamental shift in their position?
That's a key question the sources raise. This increased public visibility didn't necessarily mean a radical change in the way women were viewed, or their position within society, or even within the nationalist movement itself. Gandhi himself held somewhat traditional views, believing a woman's primary duty lay in looking after the home and hearth. And the Congress leadership, while welcoming women's participation, was often reluctant to give them positions of actual authority within the organization, seeming more keen on their symbolic presence.
Another crucial group with a complex and evolving relationship with the nationalist movement was the community often referred to then as untouchables, or Dalits, as they increasingly began to call themselves.
Yes, for many Dalits, the abstract concept of Swaraj didn't automatically resonate because it didn't seem to directly address the centuries of social discrimination and economic oppression they faced. For a long time, the Congress leadership had largely ignored the issue of untouchability, partly out of fear of offending conservative high-caste Hindus, the so-called Sanatanis, whose support they also needed.
But Gandhi personally made the removal of untouchability absolutely central to his vision of Swaraj.
Who did? very strongly. He declared that true Swaraj couldn't be achieved in 100 years if untouchability wasn't eliminated. He started referring to Dalits as Harijan, meaning children of God, and organized specific satyagrahas to secure their entry into temples and access to public wells, tanks, roads, and schools. He even cleaned toilets himself to dignify the work of sweepers and tried to persuade upper castes to change their hearts.
But many Dalit leaders felt that moral persuasion wasn't enough. They sought political empowerment as the key.
Yes, exactly. Leaders like the brilliant Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who organized Dalits into the Depressed Classes Association in 1930, were increasingly focused on finding political solutions to social disabilities. They demanded things like reserved seats in educational institutions and, crucially, separate electorates for Dalits in legislative councils. They believed political power was the only way to truly solve their problems.
This led to that famous and intense clash between Ambedkar and Gandhi at the Second Roundtable Conference.
It did. Ambedkar demanded separate electorates for Dalits. When the British government seemed inclined to concede this demand, Gandhi undertook a fast unto death. He believed that separate electorates would permanently segregate Dalits from the broader Hindu society and slow down the process of their integration.
And this confrontation ultimately resulted in the Pune Pact.
Yes. In September 1932, Ambedkar ultimately accepted Gandhi's position and compromised. The Pune Pact reserved seats for Dalits, referred to as the scheduled castes, in provincial and central legislative councils. But these representatives were to be elected by the general electorate, not a separate one. Despite this pact, the Dalit movement often remained apprehensive about the Congress-led nationalist movement continuing to carve out its own political path.
Finally, how did the Muslim community as a whole engage with the civil disobedience movement? Was there widespread participation like during the Khilafat days?
The response was much more muted this time. Some Muslim political organizations were hesitant, even lukewarm, towards the civil disobedience movement. After the decline of the non-cooperation Khilafat movement in the early 1920s, a large section of Muslims began to feel increasingly alienated from the Congress.
Why was that?
This feeling was amplified from the mid-1920s onwards as the Congress appeared, to many Muslims, to be more visibly associated with openly Hindu religious nationalist groups, like the Hindu Mahasabha.
And communal relations generally worsened during this period.
Yes, unfortunately. Communal clashes and riots became more frequent in various parts of India, often triggered by things like militant religious processions. Each riot seemed to deepen the distance and mistrust between the two communities. There were attempts at unity, though. In 1927, the Congress and the Muslim League made efforts to renegotiate an alliance.
But they couldn't bridge the gap.
Crucial differences remained, especially over the question of representation in future legislative assemblies. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a key Muslim League leader at the time, was willing to give up the demand for separate electorates if Muslims were assured reserved seats in the Central Assembly and proportional representation in the Muslim-majority provinces, like Bengal and Punjab. But this potential compromise failed to gain acceptance at the All-Parties Conference in 1928, partly due to strong opposition from figures within the Hindu Mahasabha, like M.R. Jayakar.
So by the time the civil disobedience movement was launched in 1930, there was already an atmosphere of considerable suspicion and distrust.
Exactly. Consequently, large sections of Muslims did not respond to the call for a united struggle in the same way they had a decade earlier. Many Muslim leaders and intellectuals expressed deep concerns about the status of Muslims as a minority within India. They feared that their distinct culture and identity might be submerged under the domination of a Hindu majority in an independent India.
Our sources actually include a quote from Sir Muhammad Iqbal, the famous poet who was president of the Muslim League in 1930, articulating this very concern.
Yes, Iqbal, in his presidential address, reiterated the importance of separate electorates as a vital safeguard for Muslim political identity. He argued that India wasn't just a single territorial unit like European nations, but a collection of distinct cultural groups, and the principle of allowing each group the freedom to develop along its own lines needed recognition. He justified the demand for the formation of a consolidated Muslim India within India. While expressing respect for other communities, his primary loyalty, he stated, was to his own communal group, which he saw as the source of life and identity. This really highlights how fundamentally different the vision of the future nation could be, even among those opposing British rule.
So alongside all these political movements and the complex social dynamics, the idea of a collective Indian identity, a sense of belonging to one nation, was also being actively built through cultural means.
Absolutely. Nationalism isn't just about protests and political strategies. It's also about capturing people's imagination, creating a shared feeling. This happens significantly through cultural processes, through history and fiction, folklore and songs, popular prints and symbols.
And key symbols emerged that people could rally around, like the image of Bharat Mata, Mother India.
Yes, the identity of India came to be visually associated with the image of Bharat Mata. This idea really took shape in the 20th century. The image was first created by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who also wrote the iconic hymn Vande Mataram, I Praise Thee, Mother, in the 1870s, which later became a rallying cry.
And artists portrayed her in different ways.
Famously, Abanindranath Tagore painted Bharat Mata in 1905 as this very serene, ascetic figure, calm, composed, divine, spiritual. She was shown dispensing learning, food, and clothing, holding a mala, emphasizing her ascetic quality. But over time, especially in popular prints, Bharat Mata acquired different forms, sometimes shown with a trishul, the trident, standing beside a lion and an elephant, symbols of both power and authority.
And devotion to this mother figure became directly linked with nationalism.
Yes, absolutely. The idea of sacrificing for the motherland became incredibly powerful, and devotion to this mother figure was seen as evidence of one's nationalism. You see pictures, like one mentioned in the source, showing Nehru holding an image of Bharat Mata alongside the map of India.
Nationalists also turned inwards, towards folklore, to find a sense of authentic national identity.
They did. In the late 19th century, nationalists started recording folk tales sung by bards and toured villages to gather folk songs and legends. They believed these represented the true, traditional culture of India, which they felt had been corrupted and damaged by outside forces, mainly British influence. Preserving this folk tradition was seen as essential to discovering one's national identity and restoring a sense of pride in the past.
Any examples of this effort?
Rabindranath Tagore himself led the movement for collecting ballads, nursery rhymes, and myths in Bengal. In Madras, Natesa Sastry published a massive 4-volume collection of Tamil folk tales called The Folklore of Southern India. He believed folklore was national literature, calling it the most trustworthy manifestation of people's real thoughts and characteristics.
Flags also became really important symbols of unity and defiance.
Hugely important. During the Swadeshi movement in Bengal in the early 1900s, a tricolor flag, red, green, and yellow, was designed. It had 8 lotuses representing the 8 provinces of British India, and a crescent moon representing Hindus and Muslims. Later, by 1921, Gandhiji had designed the Swaraj flag, another tricolor, red, green, and white, with a spinning wheel in the center.
The spinning wheel representing self-help.
Exactly, representing the Gandhian ideal of self-reliance or self-help. Carrying this flag aloft, holding it high during processions or movements, became a powerful symbol of defiance against British rule.
And history itself was reinterpreted, wasn't it? The narrative was reframed.
Yes. By the end of the 19th century, many Indians felt that history needed to be rethought, presented differently, to instill a sense of national pride. The British often portrayed Indians as backward, primitive, incapable of governing themselves.
So the Indian response was to look back.
Indian historians and nationalists looked to the past to discover India's great achievements. They wrote about the glorious developments in ancient times in art and architecture, science and mathematics, religion and culture, law and philosophy, crafts and trade.
Creating a different narrative.
The narrative became one of a glorious past, followed by a history of decline when India was colonized. These nationalist histories urged readers to take pride in India's past achievements and to struggle to change the miserable conditions of life under British rule.
But even these efforts to unify through culture and history sometimes had unintended consequences, creating potential divisions.
They did. This effort to unify wasn't without its problems. When the past being glorified was predominantly Hindu, when the images celebrated drew heavily on Hindu iconography, then people from other communities, particularly Muslims, could feel left out, excluded from the very idea of the nation being celebrated.
Right. So, looking back at this entire period through the lens of these sources, it's incredibly clear that the rise of nationalism in India wasn't a simple, single, monolithic story.
Not at all. What we see is that the growing anger against the colonial government was a powerful engine that brought together various different groups and classes into a common struggle for freedom, especially in the first half of the 20th century.
And the Congress, particularly under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership, played a critical role in trying to channel these diverse grievances into organized movements for independence.
Yes, they tried to forge this unity. Nationalists were constantly trying to bring people together. But the inherent diversity of India meant that the different groups and classes participated in these movements with varied aspirations and expectations. Freedom didn't mean the same thing to everyone. Swaraj was a collective goal, but its meaning was often deeply personal and group-specific.
And managing those differing aspirations, trying to keep everyone under one umbrella, was a constant challenge for the Congress leadership.
Precisely. Congress continuously attempted to resolve differences and ensure that the demands of one group didn't alienate others. This is why the unity forged during these movements often broke down. You see these high points of nationalist activity and unity, often followed by phases of disunity and internal conflict between different groups.
So what ultimately emerged, it seems, was a nation, yes, but a nation with many distinct voices, all wanting freedom from colonial rule, but perhaps envisioning that freedom in different ways.
It's a complex tapestry. And you see that dynamic playing out even later. Think about the Quit India movement in 1942 again. You see widespread discontent translating into this massive call for the British to withdraw, involving incredibly diverse groups, facing a very strong British response, but still reflecting those multiple aspirations simmering beneath the surface unity.
Okay, let's try and unpack this a little. What really stands out when you see how all these different groups, from rich peasants laser focused on revenue rates, to tribal villagers fighting restrictive forest laws, industrial workers demanding better wages, women stepping dramatically into public life for the first time, and Dalits demanding fundamental political power and social dignity, how each of them carved out their own meaning from that powerful call for Swaraj.
I think what's truly fascinating is how the nation, or the idea of fighting for Swaraj, became this kind of framework, maybe even a language, through which these incredibly localized and specific grievances, things that might have otherwise remained separate struggles, could be expressed and connected, however loosely sometimes, to a larger, collective, all-India struggle. It gave local fights a national resonance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even a bit tricky. How the very symbols and histories that were consciously created to forge unity, like the potent image of Karat Mata or the celebration of a specific glorious ancient past, could sometimes, perhaps unintentionally, end up creating feelings of exclusion for communities who didn't see their own history or identity fully reflected in those particular symbols.
That tension is absolutely central. This raises such an important question, one that echoes down to the present day. If the very foundations of Indian nationalism were built from the beginning on such a diverse, sometimes competing, sometimes even conflicting set of aspirations and identities, how does that inherent dynamic, that multiplicity of voices within the nation, continue to shape the idea and the reality of India as a nation today?
It's a crucial question to keep asking, isn't it? And definitely something for you, the listener, to keep mulling over as you continue your own deep dive into the history of the subcontinent and its ongoing evolution.